Something happens when the empath stops. Not something small, not the ordinary adjustment of a dynamic recalibrating around changed conditions. Something more fundamental than that. Something that reaches into the avoidance interior and disrupts structures that were not built to withstand this specific kind of pressure. The going crazy is not literal. It is the particular, specific interior experience of someone whose entire relational operating system encounters conditions it was not designed to process, whose defenses, sophisticated, practiced, largely automatic, suddenly finds itself running protocols that do not apply to the situation, whose background predictions about how the dynamic works are being contradicted so thoroughly and so persistently that the system cannot find adequate footing. It looks from the inside like an inability to settle, like the thinking that keeps returning to the empath without permission and without relief, like the restlessness that the usual management tools cannot adequately address, like the specific, uncomfortable, this is different quality of an interior that was organized around a set of conditions that no longer exist and has not yet found a way to reorganize around the conditions that do. The going crazy is the disorganization. The specific, involuntary, cannot be efficiently managed experience of a system that was running smoothly on predictions that have been completely contradicted. Understanding what produced the smooth running first, what the empath's consistent presence was doing in the background of the avoidant psychology, is necessary for understanding why its removal produces what it produces. The empath's presence was doing more than the avoidant consciously recognized. This is the piece that tends not to be fully acknowledged in conversations about this dynamic. The specific, functional, psychologically real work that the empath's consistent, genuine presence was performing in the avoidance interior, without either party necessarily being aware of it. The work was threefold. First, the empath's consistent orientation toward the connection was providing the avoidant with a continuous, low-level reassurance that they were not actually alone. Not the acknowledged reassurance. The avoidant's self-sufficiency narrative precluded the acknowledgement of needing reassurance, but the functional reassurance, the specific body-level, nervous system-registered quality of knowing, without having to name the knowing, that someone was genuinely oriented toward them, that the connection was alive, that the care was present, even in the conditions of the avoidant's managed distance. That functional reassurance was quietly doing regulatory work, was providing a floor beneath the defended life, a minimum level of genuine connection that prevented the defended self-sufficiency from tipping into the specific, acute loneliness that genuine isolation produces. The avoidant could maintain the distance and simultaneously benefit from the reassurance that the empath's presence provided, could feel, without acknowledging feeling, something like safety. Second, the empath's consistent reaching was providing the avoidant with what might be called relational proof of concept, the ongoing evidence that genuine connection was available to them, that they were capable of being genuinely cared for, that the defended life, organized around the premise that genuine love leads to genuine loss and genuine loss is unsurvivable, was not the only available condition. This evidence was not being acted on. The avoidant was not using the proof of concept as the motivation to close the gap between the interior love and the adequate behavioral expression, but it was present. And its presence meant the avoidant did not have to fully reckon with the question of whether genuine connection was available to them at all. The empath's consistent reaching answered that question affirmatively, without the avoidant having to do anything to maintain the answer. Third, the empath's presence was absorbing the consequences of the avoidance pattern, was compensating for the insufficient showing up, was maintaining the viability of the connection through the quality of their own genuine investment rather than through any mutual effort, was, in the most honest accounting, carrying the connection in a way that meant the avoidant never had to fully feel what the pattern would cost in its absence. The empath going silent removes all three simultaneously. The functional reassurance disappears. The specific, low-level, quietly regulatory quality of someone genuinely oriented toward the avoidant is no longer present, and the avoidant, for perhaps the first time in the dynamic, is living in the actual conditions that the defended life produces when no one is compensating for its costs. Those conditions are lonelier than the narrative claimed. The self-sufficiency narrative said the defended life was adequate, was the honest expression of someone who did not need much from others, was the genuine, freely chosen preference of someone for whom independence was a value rather than a defense. The loneliness that arrives when the empath's presence is removed contradicts the narrative, is specific in a way that generic loneliness is not, has the named shape of the specific person whose presence was providing the quiet regulatory floor that the self-sufficiency narrative was obscuring. The relational proof of concept disappears. The ongoing evidence that genuine connection was available is no longer present, and the avoidant is left in the specific, more naked, less buffered condition of someone who must now actually reckon with the question the empath's consistent presence was answering on their behalf. Not just, is genuine connection available, but am I capable of sustaining it? Am I capable of being adequate to it? Am I able to be, in the ordinary conditions of an actual mutual relationship, the person whose behavior reflects what the interior genuinely contains? The empath's presence was making it possible to defer that question indefinitely. The silence makes deferral unavailable, and the consequences absorption disappears. The avoidant, for perhaps the first time, is experiencing the full, uncompensated, not carried by someone else's consistent investment reality of what the pattern produces when it runs without a person on the other side absorbing its costs. The connection that was being sustained almost entirely by the empath's effort is simply gone, not reduced, gone. There is nothing left of it that the avoidant's own behavioral patterns would produce. The intermittent warmth is not sufficient to maintain connection in the absence of consistent mutual investment. The genuine interior love is real and entirely invisible because it has no behavioral expression to give it any reality in the shared space between two people. The avoidant is left with the interior love and the empty space where the empath's presence was. And the going crazy is the interior love pressing against the empty space without being able to do anything about it. The pressing without being able to do anything is the specific, acute, most immediately distressing quality of the going crazy. The avoidant is not without feeling, is not in the clean, empty, nothing is happening condition of genuine indifference, is in the full, activated, this matters enormously condition of someone whose genuine feeling has been fully activated by the conditions of the loss. The genuine feeling is real, and the capacity to act on it, to reach genuinely, to express honestly, to do something with the feeling that would give it any traction in the actual shared space between the avoidant and the empath, that capacity is exactly as limited as it was before the silence. The silence did not change the avoidance capacity, did not, by producing the going crazy, automatically develop the interior resources that the gap between feeling and expression requires to close. The going crazy is the feeling running without the capacity to express it adequately, the same gap as before, now fully felt rather than partially buffered by the empath's compensating presence. That gap, felt directly, without the buffer, in the full weight of its actual cost, is the most honest contact the avoidant has had with their own pattern's consequences. And what they do with that contact is the genuine question, the one that has no predetermined answer, the one that belongs entirely to the avoidant's own choosing. The empath in the silence is not thinking about the going crazy, is not monitoring the avoidant's interior for the evidence of the disruption, is not hoping the going crazy will produce the reaching, that will produce the return, that will produce the genuine showing up that the dynamic was always trying to become. The empath is somewhere else, not geographically necessarily, but interiorly, in the genuine, forward-moving, fully inhabited space of their own life that the silence made possible by ending the allocation of interior resources to the ongoing management of a dynamic that was not returning what it was consuming. The empath's own interior is quieter than it was during the dynamic, not the quiet of suppression, The quiet of someone who is no longer running the constant background process of the avoidance temperature monitoring, the signal interpretation, the generous reading of insufficient behavior, the hope maintenance in the face of consistent evidence that the hope was being asked to carry more than hope can sustain. That quietness is the beginning of something, not the dramatic beginning of a new life. The quiet, unremarkable, genuinely nourishing beginning of a self that is being returned to itself, day by day, in the ordinary hours, without the portion of the interior that was perpetually allocated to someone else's availability being available again for the actual living of the actual life. The going crazy in the avoidant and the quieting in the empath are happening simultaneously, in the same relational space, at the same time, producing entirely different interior experiences that are the honest expression of what the dynamics arrangement actually was. The arrangement was the empath sustains the connection through the quality of their consistent investment, and the avoidant benefits from the sustained connection without having to sustain it. The empath's interior is organized around the maintenance of the arrangement. The avoidance interior is buffered by the arrangement from the full cost of the pattern. The silence ends the arrangement, and the simultaneous going crazy and quieting are what ending the arrangement actually feels like for each person. The avoidant going crazy is the experience of losing the buffer, of the pattern's full cost becoming directly felt without the compensation of the empath's consistent presence absorbing it, of the interior love pressing against the empty space where the empath was and finding nothing, no buffer, no compensation, no ongoing proof of concept, no functional reassurance, just the genuine, unmediated, this is what the pattern actually produces experience of a defended life, without the empath's quiet work keeping its costs from being fully felt. The empath quieting is the experience of the buffer being lifted from the other side, of the interior resources that were maintaining the arrangement becoming available again, of the self, the genuine, full, forward-moving self that was being partially occupied by the arrangement's demands, beginning to expand back toward its natural dimensions. Both real, both honest, both the accurate expression of what the arrangement actually was and what its ending actually costs each party. The going crazy will either become something or it will not. Will either become the genuine, forced by the conditions, no longer deferrable reckoning with the pattern's cost and the question of adequacy and the willingness to do the work that genuine change requires. Or it will gradually, through the management and the substitution and the defended life's capacity to absorb discomfort over sufficient time, become something quieter. Will settle from the acute, this is different distress of the immediate silence into the more chronic, lower volume, not quite resolved quality of something that was not adequately processed but has been managed into a tolerable background condition. Both possible, neither predetermined. What determines which depends entirely on the avoidant's own genuine choosing, on whether the going crazy is engaged with honestly or managed, on whether the forced question is answered genuinely or deferred again through whatever new mechanism the defended life finds to make deferral possible. The empath does not wait for the answer, is not available to be the answer, is living their life, fully, in the quiet that the silence produced, in the expanding interior that the ending of the arrangement made possible, in the ordinary days that belong, completely and without condition, to them. The avoidant is going crazy in the space where the empath used to be. The empath is somewhere else entirely, present to their own life, in a way they could not be while carrying what they were carrying. That is not the ending. That is the beginning of the only thing that was ever genuinely theirs to build. Their own life, completely inhabited, right now. The going crazy does not stay at the same intensity. That is one of the first honest things to say about what happens after the initial disruption of the empath silence lands in the avoidance interior. The acute phase, The specific, activated, this is different quality of the immediate aftermath has a particular intensity that the subsequent phases do not sustain. The system that was disrupted begins, through whatever mechanisms the defended life has available, to attempt restabilization, to find new footing in the changed conditions, to develop some relationship with the absence that does not require the full, acute, this is unmanageable level of activation that the initial silence produced. This restabilization is not the same as resolution. It is the management asserting itself in new conditions. The defense, sophisticated, adaptive, capable of developing new protocols when the old ones encounter conditions they were not designed for, beginning to construct an adequate response to the specific challenge of the empath's genuine absence. The management's response to the going crazy tends to take recognizable forms that are worth naming honestly because they can look, from the outside, like resolution when they are actually management. Like the avoidant having processed something when they have actually contained it. Like genuine movement through the interior experience when what is actually happening is the reduction of the acute experience to something more tolerable without the fundamental conditions that produced it being addressed. The first management form is the reconstruction of the narrative. The narrative that made the distance sensible, the one about incompatibility, about timing, about something not being quite right, gets reasserted and reinforced, gets developed with additional detail, gets built into something more structurally complete, more internally consistent, more capable of bearing the weight of the going crazy without collapsing under the evidence that the going crazy itself is providing. The going crazy is evidence against the narrative. The narrative said the connection was not quite right. The distance was appropriate. The empath was wonderful, but ultimately not the person. The going crazy, the specific, acute, this person's specifically quality of the interior disruption, says something entirely different. Says the person was real, and the feeling was real, and the absence is not the generic discomfort of a connection ending, but the specific, named, this person and not a substitute quality of losing someone who genuinely mattered. The narrative management works by converting that specific evidence into something the narrative can accommodate, by finding ways to explain the going crazy that do not require the acknowledgement of what the going crazy is actually expressing, by attributing the interior disruption to the disruption of routine rather than the loss of genuine connection, to the specific circumstances of the separation rather than the specific quality of the person who is absent, to anything, in short, that maintains the narrative's coherence without requiring the honest confrontation with what the going crazy is honestly revealing. This management is not dishonest in the conscious, deliberate sense. It is the psyche doing what the psyche does when genuine experience is in conflict with the operating narrative, finding ways to accommodate the experience without updating the narrative, finding the interpretation that allows both the experience and the narrative to coexist without the contradiction between them requiring the narrative to change. The second management form is the substitution attempt. The specific interior disruption, the going crazy, has a particular named quality that the avoidance system registers as requiring address. The management's response is to seek the address through the substitution of available alternative sources for what the empath's presence was providing. Other connections, other engagements, other sources of the warmth, the reassurance, the functional regulatory support that the empath's presence was quietly providing. Not sought with the conscious intention of replacing the empath, the narrative would not frame it that way, but sought with the functional motivation of a system that is registering the absence of something it was relying on and is looking for what is available to address the resulting insufficiency. The substitution works imperfectly. As has been described throughout this conversation in other contexts, the specific quality of generic connection failing to fill the specifically shaped absence of a particular person. The avoidant discovers this through the attempt, rather than through the prior knowledge, engages with the available alternatives, and finds that the going crazy does not respond to them with the relief it would respond to if the going crazy were about generic connection, rather than this specific person. The imperfect substitution is itself information. Is the avoidance system being provided through the direct experience of the substitution's failure with more accurate data about what the going crazy is actually about the specific, irreplaceable quality of what the empath provided that no generic alternative addresses? Whether the avoidant receives that data as the information it is, as the honest, experience based evidence that what was lost was specific and significant and not substitutable, or whether the data is itself managed into something less confronting, is the question that determines what happens next. The third management form is the most sophisticated and the most difficult to see clearly from either the inside or the outside. It is the controlled approach, the specific, carefully calibrated, not quite genuine reaching that the avoidant deploys when the going crazy has reached sufficient intensity that the pure management of containment is no longer adequate. When something must happen in the direction of the empath because the interior pressure of the genuine feeling has accumulated past the point where the management can hold it at the surface level. The controlled approach is not the genuine reaching, is not the direct, honest, genuinely vulnerable expression of what the going crazy has been revealing. It is the approach with the management still running, with the avoidant maintaining enough control over the expression that the approach does not constitute the genuine exposure that genuine reaching would require. It tends to look like the thin reasoned contact, the peripheral signal, the approach that has enough plausible deniability built into it that if the empath does not respond, or responds in a way that confirms the avoidant's fear that the vulnerability was a mistake, the approach can be reframed as something other than what it was. The controlled approach is the going crazy finding the smallest available exit that does not require the full opening of the interior that genuine reaching would demand. The minimum viable expression of the accumulated interior pressure that allows enough release to reduce the going crazy to a manageable level without the full exposure of genuine vulnerability. Whether the empath responds to any of these management forms, the narrative reconstruction, the substitution attempt, the controlled approach, and how they respond, is the specific practical question that the going crazy eventually produces. The empath who has genuinely gone quiet, whose silence is the honest, arrived at, not strategically deployed conclusion of genuine exhaustion rather than the performance of non-interest, is not organized around the avoidance management forms as the events to respond to, is not monitoring for the controlled approach as the signal that the going crazy has reached the threshold of genuine motivation, is not interpreting the narrative reconstruction as the evidence that genuine processing is or is not happening, is not available to be the address for the substitution attempt's failure, is living their own life in the genuine, forward-moving, fully inhabited quality of someone who has released the primary orientation toward the avoidance interior state as the organizing concern of their own interior. This is not hardness. This is not the strategic maintenance of distance in the hope of producing a particular response. It is the honest, actual, lived condition of someone who has genuinely returned to themselves, whose interior is genuinely occupied by the actual content of their own actual life, rather than by the monitoring of the avoidance management forms. The empath in the silence is discovering something that the dynamic was preventing them from discovering. Not a dramatic revelation, a quiet, cumulative, gradually more available quality of their own experience that the dynamic's demands were obscuring. The quality of their own genuine rhythm. The specific, personal, this is how I actually move through the world rhythm of someone who is not calibrating their own pace and temperature and direction to the management of someone else's availability, who is not accelerating or slowing or adjusting or redirecting in response to the avoidance temperature, who is simply moving at their own genuine pace through their own genuine days. That rhythm was always there, was the empath's own, genuinely theirs, the natural expression of who they are when they are most fully themselves. But during the dynamic, it was partially overridden by the constant calibration to the avoidance conditions, The monitoring that was always running in the background required the empath's own rhythm to be perpetually responsive to information from outside themselves, to adjust in small and large ways to the conditions of the dynamic rather than the conditions of their own genuine interior. In the silence, the calibration stops, the monitoring runs lower, the adjustment becomes unnecessary because there is nothing to adjust to, and the empath's own rhythm, freed from the constant override of the calibration, begins to reassert itself. The reassertion feels strange initially, unfamiliar. The empath does not always immediately recognize their own rhythm because the calibration had been running long enough that the calibrated version had become the normalized version. The sense of something being off, of the pace being different from what it was, of the days having a different quality, is the honest recognition of genuine rhythm returning rather than the evidence that something is missing. What was missing was the self, the genuine, uncalibrated, moving at its own pace self that the dynamic was partially consuming. And its return, gradual, unremarkable, in the ordinary texture of the days, is the genuine beginning of the life that the empath's silence made possible. The avoidance going crazy and the empath's rhythm returning are the two sides of the same truth. The truth that the arrangement was not what the narrative claimed it was not the neutral coexistence of two people who were not quite compatible finding their natural distance, was the specific, functionally asymmetric, one person carrying what should be shared arrangement that the avoidance pattern and the empath's genuine love produced together. The going crazy is the avoidant feeling the full weight of that truth for the first time, without the empath's presence softening the landing. The rhythm returning is the empath feeling the full lightness of that truth for the first time, without the arrangement's demands consuming the energy that the lightness required. Both honest, both the accurate experience of the arrangement's ending from each side. What happens after depends on what each person does with their honest experience. The avoidant with the going crazy and the honest information it contains. The empath with the returning rhythm and the genuine life it is moving toward. Both have the information they need. Both are in the conditions most conducive to the most genuine available version of whatever comes next. The avoidant with the going crazy has the most direct available contact with the pattern's cost and the question of whether they are willing to become adequate to what they lost. The empath, with the returning rhythm, has the most direct available contact with their own genuine life and the question of what they want to build in it. Both important questions. Only one of them genuinely belongs to the empath, and it is not the one about the avoidant. It is the one about the life. The genuine, rhythm-restored, fully inhabitable life that is already answering the question through the simple, unremarkable, quietly extraordinary fact of continuing to be lived, completely, in the ordinary days. That are the whole of the thing.